Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today we are talking about the best way to make your CG slow motion. There are many different techniques to create slow motion, but today we will cover what is in my opinion the easiest and best way. So let's jump in and see what it's all about. Okay, so today we are talking about how to turn CG into slow motion. Now, there are many different ways to do this, and I recently released a lesson that tells you 3 different in-depth techniques on how to do this. Now, today I want to cover what is my favorite and the best technique, in my opinion, for turning your CG into slow motion. And it's my favorite because it's the least amount of bullshit. It's just the most easiest, clear cut. You don't have to do a lot. You just have to maybe put in a little extra time. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to render out our sequence at a higher frame rate. Now, if you're familiar with shooting with high-speed cameras, you know that it's really good for slow motion. And the reason why that is because you have a lot of extra information to work with. And in this case, that's what we're going to do. We're going to create extra information. So in our project, our project is currently set to 30 frames a second. Now, let's go ahead and render this out at a higher frame rate. Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to render this out 5 times as many frames. So let's go ahead and set it to 150 frames a second, right? And that way we're going to be able to slow this down up to 5 times slower than what it would normally be and still get crystal clear animation and not lose any information. Okay, so to do that, all you need to do, set your project settings to what you normally would, 30, 24, whatever it is. My recommendation is do a divisible number or a multiple number that is even, right? So in our case, we want to go 5 times, so let's do 150. We won't want to do like 153 because it's just more difficult for math and difficult for your brain, but it would still work. All right, so we're over here in After Effects. I have the rendered footage from C4D, and the footage I've imported, and I've interpreted to 150 frames per second. Now, if you remember, we were we were animating at 30 frames per second, but rendered at 5 times the amount of frames per second. Okay, so it's important that you interpret it whatever you render out as. And then the next thing that you want to do is you want to create a composition that is your final output. So if your intended output is 30 frames a second, 24, whatever it is, put it to that. Okay, so take that 150 frame or higher frames per second clip and drop it into your final output. Now let's take a look and see what we get when we do that. Okay, so when we do that, we get expected. It looks normal. It's running at the normal speed. But if you remember, we have 5 times the amount of information. Okay, so let's see if we can make it slower. All right, so let's try here. Let's go ahead and let's say we want him to get slower here. Let's add a keyframe here, and then let's see. So it's 20 frames. Let's go here. Let's add a keyframe. Now, from here to here is 20 frames, and I know the part that I want slow motion is 20 frames, and I know I have 5 times the amount of information. So in theory, I can do 20 times 5, which is 100. So I'm going to move these keyframes out 100 in increments of 10. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100. Okay, and then let's set this, and let's see what we get. And just like that, by rendering a higher frame rate, we get a beautiful, beautiful result that not only includes this animation, but it includes a camera animation. It would include any background information that you have. If you had particles in this scene, it would include that. If you had simulations, anything you had in this scene would now be slowed down. Rather than going the full CG route of slowing everything down, that can be incredibly cumbersome. It works, but again, if you have a lot of elements, camera moves, multiple characters and stuff, it might be a better option to render higher frame rate and then slow it down in post. So this honestly is my preferred method. Now, don't get me wrong, it's 5 times the amount of rendering time, which can be disastrous if you're not careful. But perhaps you consider, just rendering out the part that needs to be slow-mo, right? So in theory, it would only be 20 frames times 5. All right, so that's going to be it for today's lesson. I hope that's been helpful, and I will see you on the next one.